Well, my father-in-law came to visit a couple months ago now, I guess, which was wonderful because he's one of those people who knows how to build things. I really think there's two types of people in the world. You know, those who can sketch something out, lay it out, go get the materials, and then make it look like what they sketched out. And then people who are more like me, who have a vision in their head, they sketch it out, they buy the material, but it just ends up looking more like an abstract painting. It's just not right when you try to assemble something. I am not a builder at all, but he is. And he came down just for a weekend and he said, I would like to build you a swing set. Because again, I've got a 4 and a 2-year-old. We've got a big backyard now, and he wanted to see a swing set, swings, the whole thing. And I said, I would love that. Yes, please come build a swing set for my kids. And he goes, and I'd like your help. I thought, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Okay, yeah, I'll help you. But I wasn't excited at that part of it. I was a little bit nervous. I mean, I thought if he said, put a nail here, I can put a nail there, I can follow directions, hold this here, I can hold that there. But anything more technical or measuring or anything like that, and it was just going to end up like a disaster. Well, we got to it. It was a long day. You're starting early when the sun comes up and finishing when the sun goes down, trying to get it done. And then by the second day, I really see the whole swing set start to take shape, start to form. I think we're actually going to do this. And I got visions in my head of my girls swinging that very night, saying, thanks, Dad. Yeah, this is awesome. We love what you built. Feeling really good about that. And we got it completely assembled. And it looked like it should actually look. The last thing we had to do was hang the swings. And so I went up there, I hung the swings, and then I took a step back to look at it, and we did one thing extremely wrong, which we cracked up about. In fact, we took a picture of it so that we'd go show Sarah and the girls. But I want to see if you can figure out, what did we do wrong there? That's a swing that only a giant could love. Definitely not a 2 or 4-year-old. The swing set ended up being much larger than we anticipated. So the swings itself could not be low enough to the ground for our girls. Now, apparently, you can go buy change from Home Depot and extend your swings, which we did, but that was a whole nother day's project. What do you do, though, when things don't go as planned? When you think you're heading one way and then something goes wrong? Do you kind of laugh about it like we did? Or does that sort of thing just stress you out and kind of get you going in the wrong direction? You see, things go wrong every day in life. Usually it's not big. Maybe you measured something wrong or your car doesn't start and you have to respond to that. But sometimes it is bigger, an unplanned health event, because how do you ever plan for those? Or maybe an unexpected bill, and all of a sudden you're going, how do we budget this in? I didn't see this coming. Or perhaps you have conflict with your friends that you didn't expect, nor did you want. It just kind of came, and now you're having to deal with it. How do you respond in life when things don't go like you planned them or like you'd want them to occur? Well, part of why we studied the Bible every single week is that in the Bible we have stories of people who lived through the same things we lived through. So when something doesn't go right, we can see that in the Bible. But more importantly, we see how God responds in those situations in the Bible. That's what's important for us. And that's what you'll see in the story of Jonah today, is we'll read in Jonah's life went totally off the rails, went in a direction that he did not think it was going to go, nor did he want it to go. We'll see how he responds to it, and then we'll see how God responds in that situation. And I'm just going to give you a spoiler alert. I'm going to tell you how God responds right now so that you can see it play out in the story. But God responds with grace towards Jonah in a situation that Jonah did not want to be in. God responds with grace. And in fact, if you're filling out the back of your bulletin, that kind of outline portion, let me give you a definition for what grace is so that we're all on the same page moving forward and so you can see it in this story. But grace is the unconditional, meaning forever, meaning unending, unconditional love of God that comes unexpectedly. You didn't plan for it. It just shows up in your life. And undeserved. There's nothing you did. You didn't earn it. But God's grace is there all the same. This is God's grace. And I want you to pay particular attention how you see that grace the love of God that shows up unconditionally, unexpectedly, undeserved, how you see that show up in the story of Jonah, all right? Now, if you weren't here last week, don't worry. I'm going to catch you up right now. But in Jonah's life, he's on a boat. He's in the biggest storm he's ever been in, and he knows that the only way the storm is going to end is if the sailors throw him off the ship. And so he tells them that, you have to throw me overboard, and then they do. They throw him in the water, and the verse we left off with last week was this: "But the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights." I told you last week that we'd start here, because I know, even if you've come in church your whole life, you read that story and you go, how? How is that possible? How can someone live in the belly of a fish for 3 days? It's just hard to comprehend. It's hard to understand. And so I did a little research this last week. You would be surprised at how many articles are out there by Christians who are attempting to scientifically explain how that is actually possible. There's a whole bunch of theories on, well, what type of fish it was, and maybe it was actually a whale, like a whale shark would be big enough to eat you, and there's all these articles theorizing what sort of fish or whale could swallow a person whole. Then, if you want to have even more fun, you can be like me and go to Google News. Have you ever used that before? It's great. You can just type in, it's like a search bar, Google News, and all the news stories that have to do with your topic will pop up. So if you put "man swallowed by fish," news stories come up, like one from last year, where a fisherman was off the coast of Spain. He's in a storm. He falls overboard, and they can't find him. The Coast Guard comes out. They can't find him. And eventually he shows up 3 days later, all looking disheveled, claiming to have been swallowed by a fish and was in the belly for 3 days. Did that happen? I have no idea. But that's what he reports, and you see all these news stories going, well, this is what he says, and we're not really sure, but we're just reporting it, and on and on and on. What I come down to, basically, is that the story of Jonah, to try to understand it scientifically, is probably misguided. Because the story of Jonah surviving in a whale, it's a miracle. It's a miracle straight up is what it is, on the same category as Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 2 fishes and 5 loaves. That's not possible unless it's God doing it. And if God makes it possible, then the impossible happens, which is the definition of a miracle. Well, we see that in the story of Jonah. And even the author points out that it's God using the fish. It's God showing up in this unique and unorthodox way in the belly of a fish. And so our question is less about how it happened and more about why would God want it to happen, which is what we see when we keep reading. Why did God use a fish? Well, here's how chapter 2 begins. What's the first thing that Jonah does after being swallowed by a fish? Well, he prays. Then Jonah prayed to his God from the belly of a fish. I wonder what the strangest place you've ever prayed is. He prayed, "In trouble, deep trouble, I prayed to God, and he answered me. From the belly of the grave I cried, 'Help!' and you heard my cry." You see, this is a particular type of prayer that we see Jonah praying. It's called a prayer of deliverance. You see this in the Bible, especially in the book of Psalms. It shows up a lot. But basically, it's someone coming to God saying, "This is my situation. I'm at my wit's end. I don't know how to make it out. Help." And then God somehow interceding on that person's behalf. It's a prayer that I bet is relatable to a lot of us here, where we get ourselves into a situation that we don't know how to solve. And so we go straight to God. There's something natural in us that says, if you don't know what to do, pray. Even if you're not a regular person who prays, in those situations, you say, "God, I need some help here. I don't know what to do." And Jonah, in the belly of a fish, first thing he does is says, "I got to pray. I don't know what else to do." And he continues, and in his prayer, he recounts what he just lived through. So we're going a little bit backwards. Jonah is remembering. He says this, "You threw me into the ocean's depths, into a watery grave." Now he's talking about being thrown from the ship. which is interesting because God didn't throw him from the ship. The sailors threw him from the ship. But in how he's interpreting it, you can see that God's hand was through the whole story. And so he's saying, God, you threw me from that ship into the watery depths. And from that, you can tell he doesn't think he's going to make it out alive. He thinks that when he hits that water, that's it for him. He's done. He goes on. With ocean waves, ocean breakers crashing over me, I said, I've been thrown away, thrown out of your sight. I'll never again lay eyes on your holy temple. So what is happening right now is Jonah, he's treading water. And he's in the midst of a storm. Wave after wave is crashing down on top of him. And I bet he can see the ship just sailing more and more into the distance. And his feeling at that time is, God, you've abandoned me. I don't know what I'm going to do here. Because, God, you've had me thrown off this ship. And obviously, you've left me here. Well, you know that you can only tread water for so long before your muscles get fatigued. And that happens with Jonah before you begin to sink. And so here's what he says. This is the kind of poetic way that Jonah describes what he was feeling. Ocean gripped me by the throat. The ancient abyss grabbed me and held me tight, so he's sinking now. My head was all tangled in seaweed, and at the bottom of the sea, where the mountains take root, I was as far down as a body can go, and the gates were slamming shut behind me forever. We might say something like, and I felt like life was slipping from my fingers. That's a bit of what Jonah is saying here, where he feels like the gates are slamming shut behind him forever. Jonah's about to drown. There's no way out for him. And I wonder if you can relate to that at all. I mean, my guess is you guys have not almost drowned in your life, although I could be wrong, but I wonder if you can relate to the feeling of Jonah here. If you have gone through a period of your life where you're just overwhelmed by the stresses of life, you don't see a way out. You find yourself tossing and turning at night, not able to get a restful night's sleep because the problems of the day seem unsolvable. Maybe you can relate to Jonah, where you say, God, where are you in this time? I need you. This is my prayer of deliverance because I am at my wit's end. Maybe you can relate to where Jonah is at right here. And here, in the story of Jonah, we get perhaps two of the most powerful words of the story. Yet you, meaning God. You see, up to this point, Jonah has been describing his situation, saying, God, I don't know how to make it out of this. It is obvious that I am out of your plan, out of your sight, yet you. Meaning that God has not acted yet, but that God is about to respond. Yet you, God, pulled me up from that grave alive, O God, my God. And when my life was slipping away, I remembered God, and my prayer got through to you. It made it all the way to your holy temple. Those who worship hollow gods, these idols, well, they walk away from their only true love. But I'm worshiping you, God, calling out in thanksgiving, and I'll do what I promised I'd do. Salvation belongs to God. What a nice way to say that, right? It's a good poetic way to end the prayer, which is why I'm so glad it's followed up with this verse. Then God spoke to the fish, and it vomited up Jonah on the seashore. Reality hits Jonah right away. So how does Jonah feel like he is delivered by God? Well, it's because God sent a fish. The very fish that swallowed him, not to eat him, but to keep him from drowning. God intervened in a strange, miraculous way through a giant fish to keep Jonah around for a while longer so that Jonah could come to a change of heart. Because Jonah does change in the belly of a fish, doesn't he? You see, if you know the story, he gets vomited up, and then he goes and accomplishes what God asked him to do in the beginning. He changed in the belly of the fish. And we do too, don't we? I mean, we can't see it when we're going through something. We can't see it when we're overwhelmed with the stresses of life. But when God goes through it with us, the yet you, well, we change for the better. Maybe our relationship grows with God in that time. And that's what happened with Jonah. Jonah went through something that was probably stranger and harder than we would ever go through, and he came out of it praising God with thanksgiving. So what about for us? When you face those challenging things of life, what's your gut impression for those things? If you're like me, if we're being honest here, my gut impression when I'm going through things that are challenging is to blame and complain. We'll get that on the screen for you because I think a lot of us respond in this way to challenging situations, where we just start complaining about how it's not fair and blaming it, putting the problems on anyone else but ourselves. And Jonah could have done this, right? Jonah could have said, God, you're the one who called me to do this. You put me in that situation, so God, this is your fault. He could put all the blame on God. Or Jonah could have said, sailors, you're the professionals here. Why'd you let me get on that boat? Sailors, this is your fault. Could have blamed them. It's easy for us to complain and blame, but when we do that, it affects our heart. We become victims in the world, and then the world seems powerless to us to actually make a difference or be in charge of our own circumstances. So we can complain and blame, but it doesn't change anything. And it doesn't get us to where we want to go. So what did you see Jonah doing? Because what Jonah does is perhaps what we can emulate. Jonah did not complain and blame, but Jonah chose to trust and proclaim. You see, he was in the belly of the fish, and he didn't start there. He didn't start trusting God, but he got there. Even in this challenging situation, he began to trust that God was good and was going to use this situation for his good. You remember how we said that God's grace is unexpected? It was definitely unexpected for Jonah. He found it when he was in the belly of a fish. Remember when we said that God's grace is undeserved? That's definitely true for Jonah. If anything, Jonah should have had a reprimand. I mean, he's the only prophet to run away from God. But God did not move towards him in anger. God moved towards him in grace. Yes, the grace of God found Jonah even in the belly of a fish. You know, that's why I love the song that Roger and the band played, the Your Grace Finds Me, because that song lists so many circumstances of life where we need God's grace. Yeah, it's there in the newborn cry, in sorrow, times of sorrow and times of dancing. It's there from creation all the way to the cross. You see, God's grace is possible, and God's grace is available for all of us if we look for it, and if we're open to looking for it in those times in our lives. And so think of your own life. What are you going through right now? Where do you need to find the grace of God? Because it's there, and we can experience it if we open our eyes and realize that God is working for our good in every situation of life, even if it doesn't seem like it. You know, one of the ways we do that, and particularly up here, is that we do that through communion at the 11 o'clock service, because we remember that it is through communion that we bond with what God has done 2,000 years ago for us. We remember that on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and after giving thanks, he broke some and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat, do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took a cup, and he said, "This is the cup of the new covenant, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Every time you eat of this bread and drink of this cup, you proclaim the saving death of Jesus Christ until he comes again." When we partake in communion, it is a tangible expression of God's grace in our lives. So may it fill you up today, and may you experience God's grace through the coming to the table.